We're getting ready to move into our final panel, but before that, I'd like to ask Roger Ford, the Managing Director for Accenture Development Partnerships, to come and announce the winner of the innovation competition, which is the first year that we have had that and people have been able to vote. Roger also manages the innovation series at SID, which is not finished, it's ongoing, so please look for those in the future.
Well, thank you, everybody, and it's great to be here today. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for stopping by the Innovation Gallery, which has been open for much of the day. We had an absolutely overwhelming response to this first-time competition. But the idea of this whole innovation series is to really get us all thinking about how we can embed innovation in everything we do in international development, to truly create that disruption that we're all talking about and hearing about. And this panel is going to focus on that specific issue around disruption, and innovation can be a key part of making that disruption successful and sustainable and truly move the needle forward. The innovation series this year started with a discussion on how technology and digital is being applied in various programs and by various non-traditional players, including IBM and Microsoft, and others were present telling what they're doing today. We're going to have more of that. We also did a workshop on design thinking in international development and using empathy to create programs that truly benefit those at the last mile. So today, with our Innovation Pavilion, we thought what would be better than having you as participants in this conference actually vote on some of the innovations that are happening in the world. We started this with a first round judging a competition where myself, Elizabeth Corley, Director of Communications at APT, and Chris Light, the Chief Technology Officer at Ogama Incorporated, looked at these, each entry in a very discrete fashion. We went through a number of different factors leading up to the innovations that you saw on display. The 5 teams that competed today in the Innovation Gallery were ACDI Voca, who presented a data collector called the DB Buddy. Counterpart International that presented the Comunitas, which is the first collaborative economy platform made by civil society for civil society. Cycle Technologies presented DOT, which is a fertility app and family planning aid. Nathan Associates presented M-Access, which is a data management tool to increase incomes and yields for smallholder farmers. And Save the Children presented Youth Activate in Myanmar, which is an innovative approach to youth activism. So after having a number of you, several hundred of you, in fact, more than half of you present voted on these innovations, Counterpart International Comunitas, a collaborative economy platform created by civil society for civil society, is the winner. So please congratulate. Is a team in the audience today out there? Can you just stand up if you are? There we are. A round of applause. And I also want to say that we did have some secret judges wandering around and also taking a look at these things from really the eye of experts in innovation. Those included Sam Bishop, Senior Grant Manager at USAID's Development Innovation Ventures Group, Alexis Bonnell, the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID, and Chris Watson, the International Development Market Lead at Premise Data. And the winner of the the secret judging expert panel was Cycle Technologies DOT. So there we go. So again, congratulating those teams. They will be fully recognized via social media on the SID website. They'll be getting some certificates. I know they'll also be getting invitations to the dinner, where they'll be recognized later this year. But again, if you enjoyed and thought this was a beneficial part of the SID agenda, definitely send in your feedback. We hope to make this a ongoing part of the annual meeting, as well as this innovation series, part of what really makes SID unique when it comes to driving innovative ideas and getting us all to collaborate. So thanks again, and again, let's just give them one more round of applause.
So as the day comes to a close, after discussing the complexity of wicked problems, the need for new actors and current actors to interact in different ways, the cry for better collaboration, ways to diminish the fear of failure, open innovation without fear of competition, and examples of better ways and modalities to communicate for impact, we convene this final, really special plenary to discuss how leaders view the disruption of the development field. However, I'm going to ask you to take some action. As you listen to this panel and you pull together your thoughts throughout the day and you listen to their insights, think of one action that you will take away from today. Share it with others at the reception about how you will do things different. I have a great honor of introducing the moderator for this plenary session, which will be Michael Gerson, well-known columnist for the Washington Post, a fellow at One, and many other accolades. As we know, the bios are in the app. Our speakers will be George Ingram, Senior Fellow for Global Economy and Development at Brookings Institution, and Kristin Lord, President and CEO of IREX, and previously acting president of USAIP, among others. And of course, George has a very distinguished USAID career as well. And finally, we have Raj Kumar, founding president of Devex, and a new book by him as well, the recently released book, The Business of Changing the World, How Billionaires, Tech Disruptors, and Social Entrepreneurs Are Transforming the Global Aid Industry. There will be a few minutes for questions and answers at the end, so I look forward to this provocative discussion.
Good afternoon. Wearing my hat as a senior advisor at the One campaign, I'm really pleased to be with all of you, and I'm honored to be with these panelists who have devoted exceptional careers to helping the poor and vulnerable of the world. It's always struck me that this field, your field, has a massive gap between perception and performance. Foreign assistance is still used as an easy target on the campaign trail, even though a bipartisan consensus across 18 years and 2 very different administrations achieved some of the greatest advances in the history of public health. Foreign engagement has come into question in a period when an AIDS-free generation and a malaria-free world and an end to extreme poverty are ambitious but feasible goals. And all this pessimistic self-questioning has come at a time when the advance of technology and data and the pioneering of new funding techniques is opening the prospect of dramatic new humanitarian gains that actually empower the poor. We have all heard of someone failing upward. Is it possible that your field is succeeding downward? Hope not. I'm going to jump right into with these experts, but all of you should be, as was mentioned, thinking of questions that you have. The only requirement that I have when I moderate is that you ask your question in the form of a question. So, Raj, let me start with you. This is a really fine book that I've spent some time in, and I think people are going to find really useful. In your book, at the beginning, you make a key distinction between old aid and new aid. How do you define both of those?
So the way I see it, and thank you for having me, and thanks for having this conversation, because I think we're at a moment when things are really starting to shift. So when I talk about old aid and new aid, I'm not suggesting there is a date in the calendar at which we decide it's all new, but I think there's a couple of trends happening that are reaching this inflection point where we will look back and say, oh, that was a different way we used to do business. But one of those is the way that our industry is so oriented around projects. Right? We think about development work in the form of a project that has a timeline, it has a budget, it has a set of metrics, and this is how we're going to achieve development. We all know, people who work in this field know that development is not about a project, but that's the nature of the way we work. It's the nature of the funding that comes largely from government sources. That is starting to shift. And whether it's philanthropy from billionaires who are coming on the scene, or impact investors, or aid agencies like USAID, or the many relatively newer ones like the MCC, the models of funding are shifting, and we're moving away from a project orientation. So that's a really big one, I think, that's going to fundamentally shake up the way we work as an industry.
What are the forces you think that are pushing in the direction of new aid, and the forces that are undermining that?
I mean, one of the big ones is the sources of money. So our industry was long, what the technical term would be an oligopsony, right? And a monopoly is when there's one seller of services. A monopsony is when there's one buyer. And in our case, there were a few buyers. There's USAID, there was DFID, there's the World Bank, a relatively small number. So if you looked at the aid market 20 years ago, it's a very small group of countries, and even within those countries, agencies, that essentially set the agenda in our industry. And if you look today, the mix is much different. There are many more countries, first of all. China, for example, is maybe the second largest donor in the world. And many other countries, Turkey and Australia and others that would be on the list today that wouldn't have been there 20 years ago. But then outside of government aid programs, you've got lots of individuals who are now major donors. Gates is obviously the big one, but there are many others behind Gates as well. And then individual donors, crowdfunding from average people. When there's an earthquake in Haiti, $500 million was raised in the first few days just with people through their cell phone, right? So huge sums of money are available now that make this a much more competitive and open market, and that's one of the big reasons we're moving to a totally new form of aid.
Kristin, you and George have done extensive series of interviews with 93 global leaders in Global Development Disrupted, a new Brookings study that people should have and spend some time with. Do they agree on a few clear, shared priorities?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah.
They do not, Michael. They do not. And before I further answer your question, I do want to say thank you not just for being here today, but it struck me when you said there's this gap between perception and progress in the international development field. You were personally one of the clearest and most compelling voices helping to close that gap. And if I personally had $1 for every time I read your column and said, I wish I wrote that, we could double the size of the USAID budget.
That's very kind. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. So I think to answer your question, I think one of the biggest takeaways from the report is fragmentation in the sector. And I think that fragmentation comes from a number of reasons, a fragmented answer to a fragmented sector, if you will. One is there are just a lot of really big problems. People say climate change could swamp everything else we're doing in development if we don't fix it. Or maybe it's inequality. Or maybe it's weak governance. Or maybe it's fragility. Or maybe it's disinformation and the lack of a shared information environment. Or maybe it's eroding social trust. Or maybe it's, there are so many issues that I think there are legitimate issues that are diverting attention to many places. A second reason is progress. You know, it used to be that poverty was that light that guided the international development community towards a solution. And it is a good news story that we don't have that single objective anymore. Not that poverty has been eliminated and that we don't have serious both pockets of poverty and really large areas of extreme poverty, but there's been so much progress that I think that's also one of the things that has eroded it. The last thing I'll say is, frankly, I think it has to do with resources. I think I'm the only person on the panel who leads an international development implementing NGO, and we can't help but be influenced in our agendas by the funding that's available. And when the major donors are fragmenting their resources, they fragment our work, even at times when we would prefer to do otherwise. So, you know, those three things together, I think, lead to the report that you see in front of you.
Kristin, other than poverty, are there any other issues that surprised you for being high on the list or low on the list? You know, everyone has their own when they go through, but the absence of human rights was just pretty extraordinary to me in these answers. But
I mean, if I had given myself the survey, which I did not, I was a good social scientist. Instead, I would have answered, I think, some of the questions differently. If you ask me, what are the #1 issues that will erode progress in global development going forward, I would have said 1, violence, 2, corruption, and maybe 3, poor governance, weak human rights, rule of law. And actually, those were not issues that made it very high on the list. A fascinating thing to do for the audience is to flip to the data tables in the back. Wait, stop, keep listening. And see, yes, there were areas of concentration in the answers, but this is this incredibly long tail of answers where 1, 2, 3 people out of 93, 94 leaders we surveyed focused on a particular issue. And I think that tells an extraordinary story about the sector. We can talk more about why peace, human rights, governance, corruption, inequality didn't come higher up, but I was personally very surprised by that. And I was surprised that poverty was so low too. I mean, it had 14 answers.
George, one of the themes of the study and of Raj's book is the increasing diversity of the sector. Do leaders in this field see that as a source of strength or a source of chaos?
Yes. I think they see it as a source of strength, but they don't know how to deal with it, and they don't know what the path through it is. They see all of the new actors out there, particularly the foundations, the philanthropists, the BRICS countries, as offering alternative approaches, and that's a positive. But they also see some of those actors, particularly China, as disrupting the current norms for how you do development. And they see the traditional aid donors that they're used to dealing with no longer setting the agenda that they're comfortable with. So they're enthused, but they're very wary about how to get through this increasingly complicated maze.
Did this data give you any idea of how they define destructive disruption? Because there's constructive disruption and there's destructive disruption.
Well, we use the term disruption. Not many of the people we interviewed used that. And I can't answer that question because nobody really used the concept of disruption.
I mean, I think we're going to have winners and losers, if that's part of what you're getting at, within the aid industry.
Yeah, clearly there are some people or institutions that won't exist 10 years from now, given these changes.
That's right.
I mean, how does that work?
Well, I think, let's say you're an organization that works on nutrition, right? And you've got the world's great experts who work on that issue. The need for nutrition expertise is not going away. Right? That's a significant challenge. But the funding modalities that let you access that expertise, those are changing pretty fast. So just because you have the expertise doesn't mean you can just suddenly pivot your funding from, let's say, USAID to the Gates Foundation to a social enterprise or an impact investor to go work for Starbucks. It's not going to be that simple. And I think in that disruption, you will see organizations that may not succeed, that may not figure out how to pivot in that moment. But ideally, if more kids get the proper nutrition that they need, then at that level, the aid industry is actually succeeding. So we may succeed at a broad level while we still see some winners and losers within our sector. George?
I think if there's anything out there that's going to be truly disruptive is the advancement of localization, of local ownership, the ability of countries that are moving into middle income status to take care of the development themselves. And those organizations that have real technical expertise are going to have a future. Those that have a general development expertise are not going to be as needed 10 or 20 years from now because countries are going to be able to take care of those broad needs themselves, and they're going to be looking to the West for advanced technology, medical technologies and things like that. They're not going to be looking for a development expertise. And as some people have told us in a couple of the panels we've done, you go to developing countries and there's no concept of a development expert. there's a concept of somebody who's an expert in education or health or whatnot.
We seem to be chasing poverty into middle-income countries and to fragile states, failed and fragile states, or conflict zones. Is there the same kind of innovation in confronting those problems as we're seeing in other areas?
I think there is. First of all, I think the idea that we still have a concept of developed and developing countries.
Right.
And I think the new picture that's in front of us are really three pockets. You've got middle-income countries that are on the right path, that are growing, the Ghanas and the Kenyas, right? You've got countries that are very poor, a Rwanda or an Ethiopia, but that don't have conflict, that don't have a lot of immediate fragility. And so they're headed in many ways in the right direction, but the percentage of the population living in extreme poverty is so high, the majority of the country, they're not going to quickly not have a need for development. And then you've got the South Sudans and the Somalias, that third pocket where you have both tremendous poverty and fragility, conflict. Those challenges could be generational. Like there'll probably be a need for this community and people in this room who do this work for a very long time in places like that.
And Michael, I'll answer your question as well. I think our report shows that there's a tremendous amount of innovation that's happening across the sector, whether you're talking about middle-income countries or the other two categories that Raj is talking about. I think one of the issues, though, is that there's fragmentation here, too. People really the sector as a whole has not honed in on a few core ideas or innovations. There's so much innovation, it's actually very exciting, but it hasn't yet gotten to the point where we have a lot of clear new things to cluster around. I think people are excited about data, people are excited about technology, people are excited about new financing mechanisms, but a lot of those haven't fully borne fruit yet, if we're honest, and so we need to keep developing them. One thing that did come out in the study with respect to fragility specifically, though, if you look through the comments, is that there was some frustration that fragility is an area where, as an international development community, the leaders we interviewed felt that our responses are still inadequate and there needs to be a lot more innovation and a lot more resources, but also just a different way of working in order to confront these problems. But that, I would say, to some extent, was specific to that issue.
You seem to be saying that you can either ride a wave or be drowned by a wave. What do these institutions say they need to ride the wave?
Money. The number one issue mentioned in the survey, topping all others, and interestingly, across all demographic groups, public, private, nonprofit, large organizations, small organizations, US organizations, foreign organizations, resources. I mean, people are really worried about how to pay for development. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of excitement about these new development financing mechanisms, whether it's earned income or social entrepreneurship or social impact bonds, development finance, you name it. But there is some worry that, one, the organizations don't fully know how to capture that money yet. Secondly, that it will go to fund certain types of development and not others. And third, that it's not going to be up to the scale of the challenge. And so that's that creates a sense of real worry among development leaders, not because they don't feel they're up to the challenge of innovation or change, but just because it may not all add up to what is needed to address the problem sufficiently. It was the number one issue.
And the second thing is flexibility. They need the freedom and flexibility to innovate and to adapt their programs. And almost all funders require a prescribed process of how to get to some ordained end. And there's the lack of the flexibility. I mean, to its credit, AID is trying to introduce adaptation in their processes. But it's not easy. They're going to have to change the culture and the nature of the way they start the process of designing a program.
Raj, what about the role of failure in all this? I remember the Global Fund a few years ago revealed some corruption through their own systems. The Germans dropped out for a while. I mean, they were punished instead of rewarded for being transparent.
Well, look, we're still a very political industry, right? I mean, still most of the money, it's about a $200 billion sector, 140 billion or so is government money. And so governments are very risk averse. And that one story of a little bit of corruption, even if it's addressed, even if the money gets returned or paid by the implementer, can be exactly the thing that an opponent of aid uses. And so understandably in our sector, people are very worried about that. But I think that the big innovation that you hinted before, what is the innovation coming, it gets a little bit what George was just saying, is this idea that we're moving toward results. Like the big innovation is not a particular piece of technology or a particular piece of data, but it's changing the way we work to think about generating significant results at low costs in ways that are really sustainable. And where that's happening, where you have more of a market for results, then you can actually start to take some more risk and maybe even have some failures because you're failing in the right direction. You know, you're failing in service of getting to some better results. If it's a failure where people don't see that failure leading to a virtuous cycle of better results and more cost effectiveness, then understandably you're going to get the kind of pushback people expect today.
Before we leave the context of funding, I want to pull on a string that you had earlier. What are the role of eccentric billionaires going to be in the future? At the Washington Post, we like them. But
You like all of them or just one?
just one.
And by the way, I kind of go after that particular billionaire a little bit in my book.
There is some criticism there. How could they play a positive role going forward?
I think there's a big role for eccentric billionaires to play. First of all, just to give the context, there are a little more than 2,000 billionaires in the world today. Together, their assets are about $9 trillion, right? And growing fast.
Yeah,
Only about 10% have signed the Giving Pledge, which said it's just a non-binding commitment saying I'm going to give away at least half my wealth during my life or upon my death. Jeff Bezos has not signed that Giving Pledge. Mackenzie Bezos just signed it 2 days ago. Even among those who have signed that pledge, only a small fraction are actually giving away significant amounts of money. And so I think there is a huge opportunity, and actually it starts probably with people who work in the aid industry today, to push the next generation of philanthropists to say, we want your money, the world needs your money, but there's some rules for the road. One of the basic rules is transparency. We've got to know what you're doing. You know, so a lot of the new billionaires are putting their money in LLCs, and there are good reasons to do that. There's a lot of flexibility when you put your money in an LLC, but there isn't that expectation of transparency, and there's certainly no legal requirement of it. I think we need to push for that and say, this is the kind of a basic standard as an industry. This is a public industry in service of public goals. We need to know what you're doing with the money. A great example is Chan Zuckerberg. Right? They're doing now $800 million a year come out of the Chan Zuckerberg initiative. That's a large sum of money. It's hard to know exactly what it's going to. It might be going to very good things, but it's hard to know. They're building a very large institution. It's not a grant-making institution. They're largely hiring their own people and doing their own work. But we should know, as the public should know what's going on there.
Yep.
And another basic rule for the road is just accountability. There has to be some sense that just because you may have done very well in a business career and now you're a multi-billionaire, you might have a great idea for helping the world, but there should be some accountability for the results.
Yeah. Kristin, to shift just a little bit, do the leaders that you interviewed see changes in American leadership and the growth of nationalism and nativism more broadly as influencing their work at this point, and what do they fear in the future?
The short answer is yes, and the longer answer is that it wasn't just Americans who were fearful about this. Actually, we interviewed a number of representatives from foreign aid agencies, Australia, Sweden, Canada, one other Western aid agencies, and all of them, yes, and all of them expressed fear, as well as some of the other people we interviewed, that rising nationalism, populism were actually going to completely undermine the development agenda because, to your point earlier, they would dismiss progress that had been made in the development sector. They would spread misinformation suggesting that development is just corruption, it's waste, it doesn't go to any good, and that this could actually really undermine the development world as we know it, because even though we do have eccentric billionaires, and if you read Raj's book, you'll read about many other funders in the development world, but there's still a lot of money and influence that is coming from Western government aid agencies, and rising nationalism, populism was seen as a threat to that.
George, do they just feel helpless when it comes to these type of issues? They're complicated political issues, but they determine so much about the context in which they work. But what do they feel?
I think you're right. I think they do feel helpless because these are national level issues, and most of them are working at the subnational level, and they're not working at a political level. And this growing populism, nationalism around the world is particularly affecting them by closing spaces for civil society. Right. Which you're seeing more than just in a couple of countries. And the other thing you're seeing, particularly from the donors that they're concerned with, is increasingly donors are seeing foreign aid and development as how it advances their own national interest, rather than how it advances the interests of the countries we're supposed to be helping. And that's a fairly significant change in national attitude. I mean, it obviously flows from the refugees flowing into Western Europe. You're seeing it in this country. And nobody suggested that they're seeing that turn around anytime in the near future.
And that focus on national interest is a very short-term focus on national interest. You know, I think countries always said, well, if countries rise up over 10 or 20 or 30 years, those will be markets for our products, those will be allies to our country. We need a very transactional short-term approach. You know, we want to see results in months, not years, or certainly not decades.
Yeah. Raj, your book is a hopeful book in a lot of ways, but I'll quote you one thing. It says, though there is a strong foundation to build on, achieving something as monumental as the end of extreme poverty seems unlikely to happen on the current trajectory. What would change that trajectory?
I actually interviewed Bill Gates about that topic in the book, and he and others, and he's very hopeful, think we're unlikely to hit it by 2030. The places where poverty remains are just so challenging. And these are largely countries in conflict. So I think a couple of possible ways we can change it. To change that trajectory. One is there are approaches that work. You know, many people in this room probably have ideas or worked on projects. This really works. But our sector still is not at the point where a great idea or great innovation can bubble up quickly and scale up fast. We still have a huge challenge with getting the best ideas out to scale. So I think there are ideas, and I meet lots of people. It's one of the great things I get to do being at Devex. I get to meet lots of innovators. A lot of those great ideas are locked in the way our system works today. So unlocking them is probably the best chance we have. And unlocking them really is us changing the way our industry works from being a very top-down, donor-driven, kind of we're gonna define the problem, define the solution, set up a project for it, to a more open market where really people are competing not based on how good their intentions are, but based on the quality of the results that they're achieving and how quickly they are. So I think there's a chance. The technical definition of ending extreme poverty, it even allows for this 3% variable, because extreme poverty is not like ending a human disease, eradicating a human disease on Earth. You can get everyone down to zero, then come back up if there's a crisis. Look at Venezuela, even countries like South Africa see extreme poverty going up right now.
You can come up with infectious diseases too if you're not careful.
I guess that's true.
Right.
You could develop them. Yeah.
My answer to that would be fragility. Conflict and fragility. There are 25 countries that aren't going to make the global goals by 2030, and where most of us in this room can't do development work. Right. And until we find the lock on fragility, and that lock is going to be different for every country and every environment you're dealing with, there are going to be a handful of very important countries with large populations that aren't going to make those goals. And my colleagues at Brookings have been tracking the reduction in poverty, and the reduction in poverty has declined the last 10 years. So whereas you had a much larger decline in poverty 20 years ago, increasingly that decline is getting smaller and smaller, and we're not going to reach the poverty goal.
I'm going to take about 5 more minutes, and we're going to take some questions. It's an interesting discussion. Kristin, do the leaders you interviewed think the SDGs are a powerful tool or a flop or something in between?
No one said flop. I want to be clear about that. But I think the answer is it depends. I was actually shocked at how few people reference the SDGs. And it actually caused a lot of consternation from friends and colleagues of mine that the SDGs came up so little. I said, hey, I just report the news. I didn't write it. But I think there are a number of reasons for why there was some enthusiasm for the SDGs. And that came from primarily, I would say, foreign government officials, private foundations, and multinational corporations who see the SDGs as sort of channeling their efforts, giving some collective focus to what they're trying to do globally. They were the ones who, according to my recollection, really were the most likely to volunteer the SDGs as something that was shaping their own agendas. It really just didn't come up very much for the American NGOs and private sector developing contracting firms. And I would speculate a reason for that, although I want to be clear that I'm speculating. That's not what the major funders, and certainly not the US, is emphasizing right now. And I do think that the sector mirrors its major funding partners, because that's the foundational business model of most development actors. And so because the United States is not prioritizing the SDGs, it's just not coming up very much. And so an interesting question is whether that could change with a change of administration, or actually whether it'll just stay the same. I think that is an interesting thing to watch in the next couple of years, regardless of whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration.
For anyone, what role do you think big goals like the Marshall Plan for X or Y are going to play in the future of these issues? Because they have played some role in the past, but it doesn't seem to fit the model that you're talking about. I'm just curious.
I think it can still play a really big role, including kind of the new aid model I'm laying out, but mainly in terms of organizing funding. So you've got this organization called Co-Impact. Olivia Leland has set it up. She was the first executive director of the Giving Pledge. And so you get lots of these billionaires who they're ready to give their money away. They don't have a foundation. They're not really sure how to do it. She's trying to organize them together around big issues. So Marshall Plan level issues on health and education at the systems level. You can imagine those kinds of initiatives generating huge amounts of money, government money, private money. The key difference in the new aid versus old aid world is the people gathering all that money in the new aid world don't tell you what to do with it. They say, here's the big problem we're trying to address, and let the great social entrepreneurs and NGOs and companies in the world go and figure this thing out. What we care about is the result. And I think that is the key difference. So it's not about not having big ambitions and not trying to cook up big ideas, but it's about not determining the solution. And the big failures we've seen in development have usually been around that, trying to figure out the solution ahead of time.
On this issue of whether some issues require big goals because they require governmental action, what role did climate play in what you were getting from leaders?
So climate came out as the #1 most neglected issue across the different people we interviewed, whether they were from corporations, NGOs, development contractors, government, you name it. And they just felt like the level of investment, attention to climate change is so sorely inadequate to the challenge that it could undermine other progress in development, according to some. One person memorably told us, and we quote it in the report, that climate change is the Damocles sword hanging over development progress because it could actually start to cause reversals in some of the progress you were referencing earlier. There was also some hopeful responses saying that there could be a lot of innovation. There's actually an opportunity to make a difference, especially on issues of climate change adaptation, but we're just not there yet.
Michael, go one level below the Marshall Plan. And what you read in Raj's book, and what we heard from our people, and what you've got in Ann-May Chang's Lean Impact, is a frustration with siloed projects, with little projects, hundreds, thousands of little projects, which collectively don't appear to be adding up to development. And talk about needing to go to scale. And Ann-May says, when you start with a big vision, start small. Raj talks about going to scale. We heard our interviewers were very frustrated at not being able to focus more on scale. And I think if you look at areas over the years, take a look at the Rotary Club. For 20, 25 years, they've had a single focus on polio, 3 countries short of defeating polio. The Bush administration taking on HIV/AIDS and malaria. I think if you can have a goal for an ambitious goal in an area, you can mobilize the forces behind it and go after it.
Great. Do you want to add one thing?
A very quick story. Has anybody here heard of Hello Tractor? That ring a bell?
Yes.
A few people? Yeah? I mean, that's an example to me of the new era and how you get to scale, right? The tractor was invented 200 years ago. And yet, in most of the countries where people in this room work, people can't afford a tractor. So a young guy who's in the investment banking world quit his job, went to Nigeria, invented an Uber for tractors. So if you have a tractor, you can share it, right? This is not the kind of thing that would come out of a traditional aid project. And yet, this is now in 75% of the tractors that are being sold into Nigeria today, have the Hello Tractor technology. They're now in 5 countries in the continent of Africa. They're expanding like crazy. It's aid work, it's development work. I mean, this is exactly what we're all in it for. This is food security, this is increasing yields for farmers, but it's a different way of looking at it. It's a very big issue, but it's starting at that small level in a way that can scale.
Okay, let's do 5 or 8 minutes of questions, and we've got a.
Great. So we're going to take some questions now. This has been fascinating, particularly your last comment, because I think it really ties into the first session that we had this morning with Tara Nathan, which was really talking about how do we leverage all of our assets as a community, private sector, public sector, civil society, together to achieve our shared goals. And we talked a lot about scale. So let's open it up for questions. And we have mics that are posted around. Don't be shy. I know it's the end of the day, but there's a couple of people up here that are going to give you a really honest response if you ask a great question. Oh, we got someone coming? Okay, so I will start off the questions then and let you all get a little bit warmed up here. My question to each of you is, building off of what Raj said, what is the most promising idea you've had around scaling? Because that really does seem to be one of our biggest challenges. Again, we heard it this morning, we're hearing it again this afternoon. 1,000 flowers are blooming, but it's not creating this holistic change that we're looking for. So how do we get to that scale?
I can start. I hate to talk about scale with Larry Cooley in the room somewhere. Mr. Scaling is here, so apologies if I get this wrong. But I think part of scaling is starting narrow, in a way, right? So the example I gave of Hello Tractor is very narrow innovation, touches a really big issue. Another example I have in the book is Zusha. Anybody here heard of Zusha? In Swahili, it means protest or speak up. And the basic idea was there are large numbers of vehicle deaths in many countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, large numbers. If you're sitting in the back of a bus, the bus driver is driving like crazy, what do? So some researchers came up with this idea of putting a sticker in the bus. It just says, speak up. It kind of gives you the authority as a passenger to say, hey, slow down the bus, right? And they did a test and they found a 60% reduction in insurance claims from just putting a sticker in the bus. Very small scale idea, but then USAID picked it up, they gave it a small grant, they got to the next stage, they gave it a larger grant, and now they're in 4 or 5 countries in Eastern Africa, and they're dramatically reducing traffic accidents and injuries, right? So this is the kind of thing I think that can scale because it's narrow, it's cheap, and it addresses a clear problem in everybody's lives.
Big start small, scale fast. Kristin?
So my single word answer is actually government, which may surprise people. But, and let me speak first from the Brookings study and then from my position at IREX. Speaking for the Brookings study, one of the things that was really emphasized by the people we interviewed was the rising power and capability of national, local, and regional governments around the world. And actually, a key to both scale and sustainability is to harness, encourage, amplify that power, mobilize domestic resources through taxation and other revenues in order both to support and to continue to pay for quality development work. I mean, from an IREX standpoint, we really have seen the power of this. So for instance, we have done pilots on media literacy around the world, but we're rolling out to 600 secondary schools right now because we're working through the Ministry of Higher Education in Ukraine. We have trained hundreds of thousands of secondary school teachers around the world, but we also have trained 16,000 principals and secondary school teachers in modern STEM pedagogies in Georgia because we're working directly with the Ministry of Higher Education. And so I think when you have the opportunity to work with those ministries, that is really powerful. But I think everyone in this room, you'll have your own examples, but also they don't come along very often. And I think if we really all want to get to scale, we need to figure out ways to increasingly work directly with these governments and help them scale their own education education, health, public safety programs, and so on.
Interesting. George, any thoughts? And then we
My
have a couple
answer
questions.
is data.
Okay.
And we heard a lot from our respondents of the potential for data revolutionizing development. And we heard from a few of them specifically on real-time data. And one organization in the humanitarian relief area having daily feedback from the people they're trying to benefit on, are they being satisfied? Are they beneficial? If you could expand real-time data, I think the industry in general would have a much better fix on what's working and what's not working and how to adapt their programs.
Great. Susan has a question.
Thank you very much for this really fascinating discussion. My name is Susan Fine with USAID, and I think as you were talking, one thing that struck me was I felt like the role of organizations, private sector, civil society in the developing countries was somehow, I wasn't hearing about how they factor into the new model of development. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we do a better job of bringing the organizations in developing countries into these discussions about solutions and scaling and all these kinds of things. Thank you.
Well, like Raj, I'm going to ask if Larry Cooley's still here. because after he heard Kristin's and my presentation, he said, you got to take it global. That the limitation on our study, which we admit, is it's US-centric. And so Larry has started a conversation with us on how we would replicate our study in other countries and pull in those very voices that need to be brought in.
I think in an open competitive market, which is where we're heading, those organizations that work at the national level, they're going to automatically benefit, and they already are, right? Because if you don't have the restrictions, the compliance regulations that come with, say, US government money, you can go directly, and in fact, in many ways, it feels much more efficient to go right to a competent local, national organization. So you see a lot of that. You see this bifurcation where foundation money, a lot of it's skipping the traditional aid sector and going right to the countries, whereas the government funding from DFID or USAID or others is still going through like international NGOs and major contractors, and that's happening today. But I think as we break and this market becomes more open, you're going to see a natural competition. And the global organizations that can show they've got really strong capabilities at the national level, they can operate highly with great cost effectiveness at that level, they're going to do well too. So in a way, this takes care of itself if we get the structure of the market right. It doesn't have to be something that's a policy.
And Susan, I'll use your question as an opportunity to talk about one other issue that we haven't talked about a lot today, which came up a lot in the study and also I think in your book as well, Raj, and that's talent. So development organizations are rich with people who know how to run traditional agriculture projects in rural areas for USAID, for instance. But when you're talking about having people on your team who can speak to local investors around the world, who can actually put together very complex infrastructure projects with social dimensions, with multiple investors from multiple countries working with a new US International Development Finance Corporation, the leaders we surveyed actually said, I don't have enough of those people on my teams right now. My current team do not have those skills. We either have to teach it or hire it. Talent was the #2 concern of the leaders we interviewed after funding and resources. Talent was #2, and that was regardless of whether they were an impact investor or a foundation or a US or foreign government agency or an NGO or a private sector development contract. Across the board, talent is a big obstacle to doing exactly what you're talking about.
Interesting, very much. Thank you. We have a question over here.
Yes, I have a question for you. So you touched on this a little bit, or actually a little bit throughout the talk, how foreign aid has a PR problem, and we are all stuck in our frustrating silos, and as much as funding is changing, we are all still competing against each other to differentiate and to make ourselves specific and important, even though a lot of our work overlaps like crazy. So my question to you is, for all the eloquent communicators on the panel, what is your advice on a more practical level for how we should change the way we're communicating, not only to help close this PR gap, but also to better communicate to the people around us that, you know, we're doing okay. Oh, and my name is Bridget, and I'm with PACT.
Thanks, Bridget. I've got a take on this, which is that I think as much as our industry does great work, we have an insular feeling, right? We tend to think of the aid industry as ours, right? You got to be an insider. We use a lot of lingo. The way we talk to each other is impenetrable for people outside of this. And I think really this is a public industry. It should feel for every American or every Nigerian that they own this sector. It's theirs. That whether it's Bill Gates and his foundation or USAID, that this is everybody's. And I think if we can change the way we talk about this field and make it open to others and less insular, I think we have a great story to tell. And I think the results speak for themselves in many ways. We've got to change the tone. So the conversation we have with each other shouldn't be so different from the conversation we then go and have publicly, which I think is the nature of the way our industry communicates today.
You know, and Michael, I think you should answer this question too.
Yeah.
But, you know, where that communication needs to happen is at the local level. It's not at the national level. It's not with the Washington Post and the New York Times. The papers that are really trusted across the country are those local newspapers. Everybody in this room, all these organizations, you have people who go back home. And some of those small towns they go back to, it's a big deal when they go back. And, you know, the local newspaper would write an article that they came back and would write about what they're doing. The U.S. Global Leadership Coalition does this by working with their membership across the country of getting op-eds across the country in medium-sized newspapers, not the small local ones. But, you know, there maybe needs to be a more coordinated effort among the communicators of all of the development implementers of how you map the country and get the message out at the local level.
Sure, it would help if we stopped using certain jargon like capacity building or gender mainstreaming. Normal people don't use those words. But I think one of the things I find development professionals reluctant to talk about is the stakes. You know, we get focused on the project or the technicalities of it, and we don't talk about the stakes. You know, this isn't just about a school-to-work transition program for El Salvador, and I'm making this up, by the way. I'm not talking about any one specific project for particular gang members. It's not about the transitions or whatever. It's about saving people's lives and preventing rampant violence that is killing young people. It's not just about, Michael and I were talking about media literacy earlier. Yes, it's about media literacy, but it's also about the future viability of democratic governance. You know, we don't tend to go there. We're very precise and very technical, and there's a good thing about that. But I think if we want to communicate with other humans, we need to talk about what is truly at stake. People's lives.
And everybody has a stake in that, right? Everybody has a stake in the future of democracy, in what's happening on the border, and, you know, and so I think if we can talk in those terms exactly as you say, it will change the way people see the work that we do.
I would only add as a non-expert two things. One of them is the fact that most Americans have never even heard a story of aid success. They think it fails. And so I think it's absolutely essential to tell the stories of success in a way that open up possibilities for the future. And I think that global health plays an important role there because measurable success in a lot of high-profile diseases, but there are other areas that I think you can make that case too. And the other is just humanization. I think it's really important. And sometimes not just humanizing the recipients of aid, okay, but humanizing the poor themselves, who often bring something extraordinary to these debates themselves. I sometimes tell the story of going to Uganda when I was in government and received a group of women who worked in a mine on the side of a hill where they broke large rocks into little rocks. And many of them were HIV positive. Most of their husbands had died up north in the various conflicts. And when I met with them, they gave me, they had given $900 to the U.S. Embassy to help with Katrina relief efforts. Okay? And it's something about there's something about when you go there, when you see these things, that you're proud to be on their side, you know? It's not a matter of just receiving things, they offer something. So I think that trying to get at that feeling, it's easier when you go there, but trying to get at that feeling really matters.
You know, Michael, the encouraging thing to me is that in spite of the fact that the American people don't know much about foreign aid and aren't enthused about it, they like what they think we should do with it. They're 75%, and for 25 years, by 75%, they support helping other people in education and with health and with democracy. And just think if they knew more about these stories, how supportive they would be.
Great. We have two people who have been really patient, so I'm going to let them ask each questions, and we're going to put them both together. And if you could just be brief in your questions, and we'll give them to the panelists. Thank you.
Tamara Webb. I'm with Center for Advanced Studies in Global Education at Arizona State University. The question is basically what are some concrete examples of how you've actually seen mutuality in foreign exchange or foreign aid? How do we try to get away from some of the verticality of these aid relationships? We have the conversations about nationalism. Countries really want to be respected for what they bring to the table, and a lot of it is really us giving, them receiving. Where are examples, like Michael just explained, of instances where our countries who have typically been on the recipient end are giving and teaching us something along the way? So if you have concrete examples of that, I think a lot of countries are really aiming to make sure that if they don't see themselves as empowered, as being equal to, it'll take a long time before we close that gap, but what are some examples and activities that we're doing to try to promote that, or that sense of mutuality in the relationships?
Thank you.
Give a couple quick ones. So, since you're sitting here,
I think
MCC.
we're
I'm going to
gonna
just take the other
we're gonna get
question,
the other
if
one.
that's
Okay,
okay. I'm just
sorry,
going to pull
guys.
these two questions.
Go ahead.
Sorry. You spoke really eloquently about a rapidly changing industry that's becoming more open and at the same time a diversity of goals. One thing that shows progress across the development sector, but also this increasing entrenchment or areas that are being left behind as others progress, and these areas being in fragile states, conflict zones that are harder and harder to reach. So I wanted to ask you, how can development best serve these areas that are being left behind, and who takes the lead, particularly as USAID no longer sets the agenda everywhere? And when we talk about private sector engagement opportunities, emphasis on short-term progress in these entrenched areas, and even a lack of skills to reach these fragile states.
Thank you. So 2 softballs to end the day. Do you want to start, Raj?
Yeah, okay. I can jump into Tamara's question. A couple of quick thoughts because you're sitting next to us. MCC, I think, is maybe a good example. It still is a beneficiary-donor relationship, but it was a big innovation in the sense that the U.S. government was going to other countries and saying, you tell us what you want to use the money for, and you develop a process where you're going out to your constituents and developing proposals, and it was based on metrics. It wasn't just purely discretionary on our part. So I think that was a good example of getting toward mutuality. And then there's a group called the G7+, which is like one of these global groups of countries that you hear about, the G7 or the G20, but it's largely the most fragile countries in the world. That kind of gets to the second question. Countries that are in a state of real conflict and fragility, where they get together and tell us what they think and what they would like the broader donor community to do. So I think there are some examples of it. It's still not, by and large, the way we're structured as an industry, but there are reasons why it's the way it is today, but we can get out of those. We can change the way we work, I think.
I think an example of where we have learned is microenterprise. Microenterprise has been brought to America from work that NGOs and others have done around the world. In the 90s, when Brian Atwood was head of USAID, he had a program called Across the Border or something. I've forgotten what he called it. But he had a concerted effort to bring examples of where AID had done work overseas and had learned from it and brought it back home, and maybe that needs to be revived.
So I'm going to leave the fragility question for George, because that had your name written all over it, George. But to answer the question and give some examples about mutuality, the first thing I'd like to suggest is that I work for an organization that's been conducting international exchanges for more than 50 years. We are also a development organization. I think this notion of exchange as integral to development is actually a really key part of breaking down that hierarchy in the relationship. And when you do run exchanges, whether they're academic exchanges or media exchanges or they're professional exchanges, they're scientists, they're agriculture experts, there's a mutuality and a connection that occurs that levels the feeling, the field, and changes the nature of the relationship. So, and I think when we see even programs like the Young African Leaders Initiative, which is run jointly by the U.S. State Department and USAID, you know, those people come to the United States, they don't just feel like they're getting a handout, they're giving something to the communities here in the time they're here, and the people they work with in the United States, they feel it. They feel that they learn something and gain something. When people lose the opportunity to host those groups, we get a lot of bad feelings because they got so much out of it. And then another example I'll give at a more village level, because Raj talked about partner governments with MCC. You know, a partner of ours is an organization called READ Global Rural Education and Development. They do phenomenal work in South Asia and now in Cote d'Ivoire on locally led community development. The most poor communities with the lowest education levels, they lead their local community centers. They make a financial investment. It is transformative in the way their communities function from then on out. There are some case studies on our website if you're interested in learning more, but I think it's a fantastic example about how even the poorest and most vulnerable can not just be equals and partners, but leaders.
George, you want the last word on fragility, please?
My answer on fragility is twofold. One is I don't have a satisfactory answer for you. It's not about what we do, it's how we do it. It's about adaptation. It's about getting out into the field and figuring out what the local priorities are and pulling the answers out of the communities that you're working with. And if it's anything, it's helping communities to rebuild the social trust that is broken down in those situations. And it's rebuilding the social trust at the local level and the national level and between the local level and the national level. And you can't do that or prescribe it from sitting here in Washington. The only way to do it is for the Congress and the NSC, the White House, the State Department, and AID headquarters to give our folks, to send out the best experts we have at the diplomatic and development level into the field and give them free rein to figure out what the answers are over a long period, 10, 15, 20 years.
Great. So I would like to ask all of you to please join me in thanking our moderator and our panelists. I really think this was a fabulous, fabulous plenary to end the day because it thread a lot of the different topics we've talked about throughout the day all together. We heard from Tara Nathan this morning saying doom and gloom doesn't sell and it doesn't scale, that we need to be positive, we need to look for opportunities, we've got to figure out how to scale. George.
Let me just say one thing. I want to pick up on what Kristin said at the first, and it was a big deal for us to recruit Michael to come here because he is such an important voice on what we care about. So, Michael, we really appreciate your being here with us. And you can get our report free online, but I will say that Raj's is worth the money you have to pay for it. It's a really good read.
Awesome. Thank you, George. So I'd like to ask if we could get a show of hands. How many of you talked to someone new today? Oh, I like that. Okay. How many of you learned something new today? Okay. How many of you have a new perspective on something today? Okay. then I would say that it was a pretty successful day. But I'll also tell you we're more ambitious than that at SID-Washington. We want more than to meet someone new, to learn something new, to gain a new perspective today. We really aspire for our community, and our community as broadly as you can define it, government, private sector, NGOs, development companies, academia, think tanks, local governments and local civil society, international civil society, for our entire global community to embrace the various opportunities that we have heard today so that we can indeed advance and achieve a more equitable and a more diverse and a more inclusive world. As Anne said, we ask all of you to take action, to use the ideas that you learned today, to apply the innovations that you learned today, and to leverage all those new relationships to do well and to do good and to continue to achieve our common goal of a more equitable and free world. So I'd like to thank all of you so much for coming today. I again want to thank so much Ann Simmons-Benton, Catherine, Ann's committee, and Catherine's staff, and all of our sponsors for an extraordinary 2019 conference. And I'd also like to invite Michael and our panelists and all of you across the hall for some drinks and snacks so we can continue mingling and enjoying this conversation. Thank you.
That was fun. Thank you.